This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom, where you can pre-order every card from Phyrexia All Will Be One right now using my referral link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's that time again, set review season. The full card gallery for Phyrexia All Will Be One went up earlier today, and that means I'll be bringing you a new set review video every day until the pre-release to get you ready for the new format. In these videos, I'll discuss how good I think these cards are going to be in the new limited format. Today we're taking a look at every single multicolored and colorless card in the set. This is a good place to start, as the multicolored cards do a good job of introducing us to the set's major themes and archetypes. Multicolored cards also tend to be some of the most powerful in a set, so that's always fun. Tomorrow I'll give you my thoughts on white cards, blue cards the day after that, and so on. I use a letter grade system to sum up my thoughts on each of these cards, and if you aren't sure what those letter grades mean, check out the description where you can find an explanation. Before we take a look at our first card, a few reminders. This review is about limited. That means draft and sealed, and this means I'm only going to be reviewing cards that appear in draft boosters. Also keep in mind that these are my feelings about these cards before actually playing the new format. That means I'm definitely not going to be perfect in my predictions. After all, every single format is different. As I play the format, I will be providing updates about the format here on the channel. Lastly, I want you to know that I'm offering some set review related perks for both patrons and channel members. You get access to my ongoing notes during preview season, and by the end of the set review, you'll have a spreadsheet with all of my grades. If those perks sound interesting to you, and you want to support the channel, you can find ways to become a channel member or a patron in the description. Alright, with all of that out of the way, let's look at our first multicolored card, which is Atraxa Grand Unifier. She costs 3, a green, a white, a blue, and a black. She is a 7/7 legendary Phyrexian angel at Mythic Rare. She's got Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, and Lifelink, and when she enters the battlefield, you reveal the top 10 cards of your library. For each card type, you may put a card of that type from among the revealed cards into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. One really cool thing about this card is they're hinting at a future card type that we're going to see because Battle is listed among these other card types. This is what they did back in the day with Tarmogoyf, where they introduced both Tribal and Planeswalkers on the card before they really existed. But that doesn't really matter for Limited. So, obviously, if you can cast Atraxa, you're going to get a massive, formidable creature that also draws you something like 3 or 4 cards. That is enough to pretty much always win you the game, but the question is how easy she is to cast. Luckily, green is one of her 4 colors, and that matters, and it probably does make it possible to cast her in some decks. When you can cast her, she will feel like an A+, but the mana is challenging enough that we probably need to drop that grade a full letter. She's going to end up stuck in your hand a lot. I'm going to start her out at a B+. If it turns out she's easier to cast than I'm expecting, she could be one of the biggest bombs in the format. There's definitely fixing, it's just a question of how fast this format will be and whether there's enough fixing to consistently cast her. Next up, it's Bladehold War-Whip, which for 1 generic, a red, and a white is an uncommon artifact equipment. It comes with 4 Mirrodin, a new equipment in this format that says when this equipment enters the battlefield, create a 2/2 red rebel creature token, then attach this to it. Equip abilities you activate of other equipment cost 1 less to activate. An equipped creature has double strike, and you can equip it for 3 generic, a red, and a white. So, this gives you a 3-mana 2/2 with double strike up front, and that's great, as is reducing the cost of your other equipment. A 3-mana 2/2 with double strike is already pretty close to a B-. And this 4 Mirrodin mechanic is really sweet, because if your opponent kills the token or the equipment, you still have some value left behind. The bad news is that once that 2/2 goes down, you have to pay 5 to put this on something, and sure, double strike is a big boost on a lot of creatures, but that cost is pretty high. That helps prevent this from feeling like a full-blown 2-for-1, because the card you have left behind is mediocre, but you're still kind of getting 2 cards worth of value out of this and most of the other 4 Mirrodin cards. There's also a bunch of equipment synergy in the format. You know, this is a signpost uncommon after all, and it's telling you, hey, you're supposed to have equipment. And I think the whole package here is a pretty powerful signpost uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next, there's Cephalopod Sentry, which costs 2 generic, a white, and a blue for a star 5 artifact creature Phyrexian squid at uncommon. It's got flying, and its power is equal to the number of artifacts you control. Blue-white is the most artifact-centric color pair in this format, as Cephalopod Sentry clearly shows you. Most of the color pairs in the format deal with counters in some way, whether it's poison or oil or using proliferate more generally. This is one of the ones that doesn't care about that. On its own, this is a 4-mana 1/5 flyer, which isn't a terrible rate, and if you're in blue-white, it's likely to be a threat your opponent has to kill a decent percentage of the time, as you're likely to control many artifacts. I think this is a B-. Next, there's Charforger, which for 1 generic, a black, and a red is a 2/3 Phyrexian beast at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 red Phyrexian goblin creature token, and whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put an oil counter on Charforger. Remove 3 oil counters from Charforger, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. This is another great signpost uncommon. A 3-mana 2/3 that makes a 1/1 is already a great place to start. So, the fact that this can save up oil counters and use them to draw cards is pretty amazing. It takes some work to do it, of course, but as usual, Black-Red has ways to make its own stuff die, so it's certainly doable. Oil counters do show up a lot in this set, and there are some synergies around, and obviously we haven't seen it yet, but the proliferate mechanic works really well here too. I'm giving this a B, and I think it has the potential to be the best signpost uncommon in the set between the great rate and the ability to effectively draw you cards. Next, there's Cindermaw Ravager, which for 4 generic, a green and a red, is a 5/5 Phyrexian warrior at uncommon. It costs 1 less to cast for each permanent you control with oil counters on it. It's got vigilance, and when it enters the battlefield, it deals 1 damage to each creature your opponents control. Paying 5 for this seems very doable, and I think that will feel like a good deal when you can. You get a 5-mana 5/5 with vigilance, who does 1 to your opponent's stuff. Sometimes you'll be able to get it out there even earlier, and there are enough 1/1s and X1s in this format that you'll get to pick off at least one of your opponent's creature often enough that this is going to feel pretty good. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Ezuri, Stalker of Spheres, which for 2 generic, a green and a blue, is a 3/3 legendary creature, Phyrexian Elf Warrior at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 3 generic. If you do, proliferate twice, and whenever you proliferate, draw a card. So here is proliferate. It's a returning mechanic if you don't know what it does. When you proliferate, you get to choose any number of permanents or players that have counters on them, and add a counter of each type of counter that player or permanent has. So, like the oil counters we just saw, you would get to add another oil counter, actually 2 here, because you proliferate twice. So, playing this on 4 isn't amazing, as it does have bad stats, and it doesn't do anything all on its own, but proliferate is a huge theme in the set, so you'll be able to take advantage of it and draw lots of cards if it sticks around. I love that it also has amazing late game upside where you can cast it for 7, proliferate twice, which already is pretty strong on a lot of boards, but you're also drawing 2 cards when you do that, which makes this a powerful 3-for-1. So you sort of have a split card here, one that doesn't really impact the board at all right away, but can be a value engine, and then you have a late game card that you can cast that probably does impact the board right away and also draws you 2 cards, so it gives you value immediately. I think the whole package here is a B+. It looks like a really strong card. Next up, it's Glissa Sunslayer, which for 1 generic, a black and a green, is a 3/3 legendary Phyrexian zombie elf at rare. She has First Strike and Death Touch, and when she deals combat damage to a player, you choose one. You can draw a card and lose 1 life. You can destroy an enchantment, or you can remove up to 3 counters from a permanent. Glissa has both First Strike and Death Touch, just like she did last time, which makes for a really nasty combination. A 3-mana 3/3 with those 2 keywords is probably already a B, as it is near impossible to attack through or block. So the fact she comes with huge upside is great. She's going to be difficult to block, but if your opponent lets her through, they're going to give you some serious value. Drawing the card is going to be the option you choose the most, but the other 2 are nice to have around. I think Glissa gets into the lower bomb range. She's great all game long and probably takes over the game if left unchecked. I'm giving her an A-. Next up, it's Jor Kadeen, first Gold Warden, which for a red and a white is a 2/2 legendary human rebel at rare. It has trample, and whenever it attacks, it gets +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of equipped creatures you control. Then, if Jor Kadeen's power is 4 or greater, draw a card. A 2-mana 2/2 with trample is probably a C. It isn't like that's a scary stat line for a trampler, but it does incentivize you to enhance it, and that's especially true here, since Jor Kadeen loves equipment. If it has 1 equipment on it, it's pretty likely to get to at least 4 power, making it a formidable attacker that also draws you a card. As we've seen, red-white is about equipment in this format, and I don't really think this needs a build-around grade as a result. Most red-white decks will have 3+ equipment because of other incentives around, so I think this is just a B+. Next up, we've got Kaito Dancing Shadow, which for 2 generic, a blue, and a black is a legendary planeswalker Kaito at rare. He's got 3 loyalty, and whenever 1 or more creatures you control deal combat damage to a player, you may return 1 of them to its owner's hand. If you do, you may activate loyalty abilities of Kaito twice this turn, rather than only once. His +1 loyalty ability says up to 1 target creature can't attack or block until your next turn. His 0 ability says draw a card, and he has a -2 that says create a 2/2 colorless drone artifact creature token with Death Touch, and when this creature leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. This looks like an incredible bomb. He has a -2 that is very good at protecting him. A Death Touch body is not something your opponent can take lightly, and even if they do find a way to get rid of it, you still get to drain 2 life. He can also draw you cards for no loyalty at all and pacify a creature for an entire turn cycle. His static ability is great too, and will at a minimum draw you an extra card when you trigger it, since you'll get that ability again. Turns where you can make something unable to block to allow you to get in with a creature, then use his triggered ability to return it to your hand, use another loyalty ability to draw a card, and then just recast the creature are going to feel insane, and that isn't really a magical Christmas land scenario. Bouncing something to your hand can even be upside if you're trying to abuse an enter the battlefield ability, in which case things get really ridiculous. So this is a 4-mana card that can get pretty close to ending the game on the spot. He protects himself, he draws you cards, and even has an effect that will get pretty close to feeling like removal. He's an A+. Next up, it's Kaya Intangible Slayer, which costs 3 generic, 2 white, and 2 black. She starts with 6 loyalty. She's got Hexproof, and she has a +2 that says each opponent loses 3 life and you gain 3 life. She has a 0 ability that says you draw 2 cards and each opponent may scry 1. And she has a -3 that says exile target creature or enchantment. If it wasn't an aura, create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 white spirit creature with flying in addition to its other types. 7 mana is a lot, especially when you have to have 2 mana of 2 different colors in limited, but Kaya definitely delivers. Each time you use her -3, you're going to be getting a pretty sweet 2-for-1, since she removes an opposing creature and gives you a flying 1/1 copy of it. In other words, the effect is both removal and a way to protect her at the same time, which is insane for 1 ability. Her other 2 abilities are also good, but the -3 really is the star of the show here. It's also great she comes with Hexproof, as these days more and more things seem capable of killing planeswalkers. So yeah, she's kind of hard to cast, but she's pretty close to unbeatable on most board states. So I think she is a bomb. Her casting cost does knock her down a little bit. You know, she's not splashable or anything like that. And 7 mana is never a guarantee in limited, so I do think she falls a little short of being a straight up A. I'm giving her an A-, though obviously the times when you do get her in play, she's just going to win you the game most of the time. Next up, it's Kethek, Crucible Goliath, which for 2 generic, a black and a red, is a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian beast at rare. It says at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice another creature. If you do, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card with lesser mana value. Put it onto the battlefield, then put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. A 4-mana 4/4 is a good stat line in limited, and this ability is pretty real. You're always going to get a cheaper creature out of this, but giving up a creature that is no longer useful, or one with an enter the battlefield ability that gives you most of its value, is going to feel great. Note that it is a May clause too, which is important. In a pinch, you can even sacrifice something you attacked with to find a creature who can come into play untapped. It gets even sillier if you have some bonuses for sacrificing things like the black-red signpost uncommon we saw. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Luca, Bound to Ruin, who costs 2 generic, a red-green hybrid Phyrexian mana, and a green mana. Starts with 5 loyalty, legendary planeswalker Luca at mythic rare. It has Completed. This is a returning mechanic. It says that you can pay that hybrid Phyrexian mana with either red or green or 2 life. If you do cast it that way, it enters with 2 fewer loyalty counters. It's got a +1 that says add red and a green. Spend this mana only to cast creature spells or activate abilities of creatures. It's got a -1 that says create a 3/3 green Phyrexian Beast creature token with Toxic 1. This is the first time we've seen Toxic. It's a new way of doing poison counters. When a creature with Toxic does combat damage to an opponent, it puts poison counters on that opponent, equal to the toxic value. In this case, it would be 1 poison counter. Unlike with Infect, the creature still does combat damage, so keep that in mind. And he's got a -4 that says Luca deals X damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers, where X is the greatest power among creatures you controlled as you activated this ability. So, this is another really impressive planeswalker. You either get a 4 mana 3 loyalty planeswalker or a 5 mana 5 loyalty planeswalker. I think you're usually going to want to pay the full 5 because that gives you the option of using the -4 right away, and that's an ability that will usually allow you to kill something. However, his most consistent ability is probably his -1 anyway, as adding a real presence to the board that can pressure your opponent and protect him is great. And there will be times where his ability to start cranking those out on turn 4 can just win you the game. The +1 is probably the least impressive, but sometimes you'll want to get your ramp on. All in all, he's going to be pretty effective at removing creatures and protecting himself, and that's usually enough for a planeswalker to be a bomb. I'm giving him an A. Next up, it's Malcator, Purity Overseer, which for 1 generic, a white and a blue, is a 1/1 legendary Phyrexian Elephant Wizard at rare. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. At the beginning of your end step, if 3 or more artifacts enter the battlefield under your control this turn, create a 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. A 3 mana 1/1 that makes a 3/3 is already a great card. It's pretty much Blade Splicer. But this comes with the additional upside of occasionally spitting out another 3/3. Now, making that happen isn't always going to be easy, as getting 3 artifacts into play in one turn can be a big ask in Limited, but I think it's doable. It'll happen sometimes, just don't expect it to happen a lot. But that's fine if that's the case. You know, you can abuse this thing's enter the battlefield ability too, which is always sweet. I think this is a B+. Next up, it's Melira, the Living Cure, which for a green and a white is a 3/3 legendary human scout at rare. If you would get 1 or more poison counters, instead you get 1 poison counter, and you can't get additional poison counters this turn. You can also exile her and choose another target creature or artifact. When it's put into a graveyard this turn, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. This is a pretty sweet 2 mana creature. Obviously, she has above rate stats, but the fact that she weakens the toxic mechanic is pretty real upside here, as is her ability to preemptively reanimate a creature or artifact that is going to die. That second part is probably more important, but you're still getting a 2 mana 3/3 with 2 abilities that represent very real upside in the format. I'm giving her a B. Next up, it's Miglo's Maze Crusher, which for 1 generic, a red and a green, is a 4/4 legendary Phyrexian beast at rare. It enters the battlefield with 5 oil counters on it. You can pay 1 and remove an oil counter to give it Vigilance and Menace until end of turn. You can pay 2 and remove 2 oil counters to give it +2/+2 until end of turn. And you can pay 3 and remove 3 oil counters to destroy target artifact or enchantment. This thing is a beast. It can really cash in those oil counters for serious value, either becoming a really problematic attacker or taking down some artifacts and enchantments, or a mix of those things, and it starts with a great stat line to begin with. If this comes down on turn 3, and you can't deal with it, your opponent is probably about to run you over. It gets even sillier with Proliferate. The sheer efficiency, coupled with flexibility and usefulness all game long, is enough for this to sneak into the lower bomb range. I'm giving it an A-. Next up, it's Nihiri the Unforgiving, who cost 1 generic, a red-white Phyrexian hybrid mana, and 1 white mana for a 5 loyalty planeswalker with completed. Her +1 says until next turn, up to 1 target creature attacks a player each combat if able. Her other +1 says discard a card, then draw a card, and her 0 ability says exile target creature or equipment card with mana value less than Nihiri's loyalty from your graveyard. Create a token that's a copy of it. That token gains haste. Exile it at the beginning of the next end step. Every planeswalker we've seen so far has been a bomb. I don't think Nihiri is. She's either a 3 mana 3 loyalty planeswalker or a 4 mana 5 loyalty planeswalker. Effects like her first +1 are usually pretty underpowered. You can certainly force an attack that is bad for your opponent, but it's very situational. You won't always be able to accomplish something by using it. Her other +1 lets you rummage, which is solid but unexciting. But it can help you set up her 0 loyalty ability, which can be pretty good if you have a well-stocked graveyard. Still, the token she makes is restricted in a lot of ways. It has to have a low enough mana value, and it only gets to swing once, so it isn't like it's protecting her in most situations. She can work pretty well with the 4 Mirrodin equipment in the set because the tokens those make would stay behind and could theoretically protect her. But still, she doesn't come with a real removal effect, she doesn't protect herself, and she doesn't really net you cards in most situations. Usually, as we've seen, a great limited planeswalker does 2 or more of those things, and we're being pretty generous here if we're saying she's doing 1 of 3 of those. All of that said, she isn't a bad card, just sort of a situational value engine type planeswalker and not one that can really help you get ahead in a game where you've been behind. If you've managed to stabilize or you're ahead, her zero ability can definitely pressure your opponent, but if you're behind, it's a pretty ineffective planeswalker, giving her a B-. Next up, it's Necrogen Rotpriest, which for 2 generic, a black and a green, is a 1/5 Phyrexian zombie cleric at uncommon. It's got Toxic 2, and whenever a creature you control with Toxic deals combat damage to a player, that player gets an additional poison counter, and you can pay 1 generic, a black and a green, to give a creature you control with Toxic Death Touch until end of turn. So this card is telling you that black-green is mostly a Toxic deck, a somewhat grindier one, since you're playing a 4-drop here. That's a 1/5. It provides you a medium defensive body and lots of toxic upside. You get to poison your opponent more quickly, and giving Death Touch to toxic stuff is nice all game long. On some boards, you're going to put your opponent in a spot where they have to get a significant number of poison counters or set up an ugly block against your potential Death Touch creature. It can give itself Death Touch, and it does count itself for its ability too, so it can kind of be a one-man poisoning engine. This is another good signpost uncommon. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Ovica Enigma Goliath, which for 5 generic, a blue and a red, is a 6/6 legendary Phyrexian Nightmare at rare. It's got flying, it has ward 3 and pay 3 life. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create X 1/1 red Phyrexian Goblin creature tokens, where X is the mana value of that spell. They gain haste until end of turn. This is expensive, but it does give you quite the impressive creature. Ward 3 and pay 3 life is pretty legit, as it makes it harder for your opponent to ever efficiently deal with the Goliath, and they're going to take a hit in terms of their life no matter what they do, and that's the fail case here. Then, if you untap with it and cast some non-creature spell, the game's pretty much over, since you make an army of tokens that can either allow you to finish your opponent off, or gain a massive advantage on the board that allows you to defend yourself. You won't always find yourself able to do that, of course, but you're still talking about a 6/6 flyer that's an absolute pain to kill. I think it sneaks into the lower bomb range since it gives you solid value, even if the worst case thing happens, and if it sticks around, you're just going to win, giving it an A-. Next up, it's Ria Ivor, Bane of Bladehold, which for 2 generic, a white and a black, is a 3/4 legendary Phyrexian Knight at rare. It's got Battle Cry, which means when it attacks, each attacking creature gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Each other attacking creature, actually. At the beginning of combat on your turn, the next time, target creature would deal combat damage to 1 or more players this combat, prevent that damage. If damage is prevented this way, create that many 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature tokens with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. A 4-mana 3/4 with Battle Cry is a pretty nice place to start, and the ability here is pretty interesting. It's pretty much all upside because it doesn't say you have to choose your own creature, so if you'd rather have all your creatures able to do damage to your opponent, you can just choose one of their creatures, which won't really do anything one way or another since it only counts combat damage done to a player. And sometimes you can choose your own thing if you really need to go wide with pests, and that works especially well alongside the Battle Cry effect. It does feel like with this card, you're probably going to kill your opponent with damage before you kill them with poison, but if they already have poison around, then it can pressure them in a couple of different ways. I think this is a B+. Next up, it is Serum-Core Chimera, which for 2 generic, a blue and a red, is a 2/4 Phyrexian Chimera at uncommon. It's got flying, and whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you put an oil counter on it. You can remove 3 oil counters to draw a card, then you may discard a non-land card. When you discard a card this way, it deals 3 damage to target creature or planeswalker, activate only as a sorcery. As usual, blue-red is into spells, but there's also an oil counter theme. Like most signposts, this looks pretty good. A 4-mana 2/4 flyer isn't an amazing rate, but it is solid, so the upside of drawing a card and being able to bolt a creature or planeswalker every 3 spells is big. The thing I don't love here is that there are going to be times when you just can't get that 3rd oil counter. Even with Proliferate around, it's going to be kind of an awkward card when you draw it in the later stages of the game where it's just a 4-mana 2/4 flyer, and your chances of getting an oil counter are lower. It doesn't impress me quite as much as some of the other signposts we've seen so far, which is sad because I usually love blue-red decks. Maybe I'll be wrong, but for now, I think it's a B-. Still a pretty good card. Next up, it's Slaughter Singer, which for green and a white is a 2/2 Phyrexian Cleric at uncommon. It's got Toxic 2, and whenever another creature you control with Toxic attacks, it gets +1/+1 until end of turn. So green-white is about being aggressive with Toxic, especially with those little pest tokens we've seen, and a 2-mana 2/2 with Toxic 2 is already a good start, so offering a boost to your other toxic creatures is nice. If you get it early, it's going to really allow you to quickly poison your opponent. It's going to make it hard for your toxic creatures to be blocked. And then if you get it late, it's also pretty good because usually, if you're in green-white, you're going to have toxic things in play, and it will change the board immediately by allowing you to attack more effectively than you could before. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Tainted Observer, which for 1 generic, a green and a blue, is a 2/3 Phyrexian bird at uncommon. It's got flying and toxic 1, and whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you can pay 2 generic, and if you do, you proliferate. This is another strong signpost uncommon. A 3-mana 2/3 with flying and toxic 1 is something you would pretty much always play, and the proliferate upside here is big, especially because it works, obviously enough, with poison counters. You generally won't have the mana available to proliferate until the mid or late game here, but the baseline is great. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Tyvar Jubilant Brawler, which costs 1 generic, a black, and a green. It is a legendary Planeswalker Tyvar at rare with 3 loyalty. You can activate abilities of creatures you control as though those creatures had haste. It's got a +1 that says untap up to 1 target creature, and a -2 that says mill 3 cards, and you may return a creature card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. So, we finally have a Planeswalker that I think is just not very good in Limited. The really cool thing he can do is allow you to play a creature with a tap-activated ability and use that ability right away. And then you can use the +1 to use the ability again, which is cool. But situations like that aren't just going to happen in your typical Limited game. There's not a mechanic in this format that plays super well with that. His -2 also isn't guaranteed to get something back, though if you do play him in the mid to late game, playing him and using the -2 probably does mean you get a small creature back. It just seems like he's doing stuff that's very hard to consistently take advantage of in Limited, and even when he does get you a 2-drop from the graveyard, it's not like you're that excited. He's probably just a D+. Next, it's Venser, Corpse Puppet, which for a blue and a black is a 1/3 legendary Phyrexian zombie wizard at rare. It's got lifelink and toxic 1, and when you proliferate, you choose one. If you don't control a creature named the Hollow Sentinel, create the Hollow Sentinel, a legendary 3/3 colorless Phyrexian Golem artifact creature token. The other option is target artifact creature you control gains flying and lifelink until end of turn. A 2-mana 1/3 with lifelink and toxic 1 is probably already a C+, and this has massive proliferate upside. Making a 3/3 is big, and you can give that 3/3 lifelink and flying when you proliferate again. Obviously, you need to have 4 or 5 cards with proliferate to really unlock this, but that's just not a big ask in this format. You'll be able to get even more than that sometimes, in which case this will be truly absurd, and the floor of this card is so good that it's hard to look at this as anything less than great. I'm giving it an A-. Next, there's Vivisection Evangelist, which for 3 generic, a white and a black, is a 4/4 Phyrexian Cleric at uncommon with Vigilance, and it comes with Corrupted. Cards with Corrupted all have an ability that makes them better if your opponent has 3 or more poison counters. In this case, you get to destroy a creature or planeswalker your opponent controls when the Evangelist enters the battlefield. So, a 5-mana 4/4 with Vigilance isn't great, it's kind of passable, but obviously the ETB ability here is huge. It's an absolutely incredible card when you can trigger it. Like, if this was a 5-mana 4/4 that always let you destroy a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls when it entered the battlefield, it would probably just be a straight-up A- because it's a very real, very efficient 2-for-1. Obviously, you have to set it up some, so it's not quite that good, but it's good enough to be a B, another one of these really good signpost uncommons. Next up, it's Voidwing Hybrid, which for a blue and a black is a 2/1 Phyrexian Bat at uncommon. It's got flying and toxic 1, and when you proliferate, you return it from your graveyard to your hand. This, our last signpost uncommon, is another really good one. A 2-mana 2/1 with toxic 1 and flying is nice, and the fact that you can get this back when you proliferate is good, especially because proliferate is plentiful in the format. If you proliferate with this in your graveyard, it effectively adds draw a relevant card to your proliferate trigger, which is going to feel great. I'm giving this a B. Alright, those are our multicolored cards. Let's move now to artifacts. First, we have Argentum Masticore, which for 5 generic mana is a 5/5 artifact creature Phyrexian Masticore at rare. It has first strike and protection from Multicolored. At the beginning of your upkeep, you sacrifice it unless you discard a card. When you discard a card this way, destroy target non-land permanent opponent controls with mana value less than or equal to the mana value of the discarded card. This is a fun callback to the original Masticore and to Argentum armor. It maintains the downside Masticores usually have, but it also turns it into a bit of upside. So, a 5-mana 5/5 with first strike and protection from Multicolored that makes you discard every turn would probably be like a C. That's a pretty real downside, even on an efficient creature, but turning the cards you discard into removal spells is big and really softens the blow. When you have this in play, you'll usually be able to get more value out of holding on to cards than playing them anyway. Now, there will be times where you just have lands to discard or you need to actually add to your side of the board, and this makes it harder to do that. You can run out of cards to discard and things go really sideways if that happens. But the upside here is so good, and the card's colorless, so it's definitely worth a pretty high pick. I'm giving it a B+. Next up, it's Atraxa's Skitterfang, which for 3 generic mana is a 2/2 Phyrexian insect at uncommon. It enters the battlefield with 3 oil counters, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, you can remove an oil counter from it. When you do, target creature you control gains your choice of Flying, Vigilance, Death Touch, or Lifelink until end of turn. This is a great uncommon. Grey Ogre stats are never very good on their own, but the ability tacked onto this is great. Granting a keyword to something once a turn for 3 turns is strong, especially because you can do it the turn you play this, if you play it in your first main phase. At least one of these keywords is extremely likely to be beneficial for you on most turns, giving you attacks you didn't have before. It can also give the keyword to itself, though that doesn't help you on that first turn, but if you don't have creatures to buff with it, you can just wait to play it until your second main phase to make sure you have all 3 of those counters ready to go next turn. It gets better in a world where you have more ways to take advantage of oil counters and where you can proliferate. I can see this getting first picked a ton because it's colorless. It'll work well in almost any deck in the format. You know, any deck that has like 14 or more creatures. Has some synergy with the format too because of the oil counter thing. I think this is a B. Next up, it's Basilica Skull Bomb, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can pay 1 and sack it to draw a card, or you can pay 2 generic and a white and sack it to give target creature +2/+2 and flying until end of turn, draw a card, activate only as a sorcery. It's cool to see a Phyrexian variant of the Mirrodin Spell Bomb. At worst, as usual with spell bombs, these can all cycle away while giving you some artifact synergy, and that makes it hard for them to be terrible. And if you have the mana here to use the ability, it does something reasonably significant while still replacing itself. +2/+2 in flying is the kind of boost that matters on most boards. I'm giving this a C. Next, there's Dross Skull Bomb, which costs 1 generic for a common artifact. You can once again pay 1 and sack it to draw a card, or you can pay 2 generic and a black to return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, draw a card, activate only as a sorcery. Obviously, you sacrifice it too. So this one can get a creature back from your graveyard and draw you a card, and once it does that, you're getting a 2-for-1. You know, it has a reasonable baseline and a pretty high ceiling for a random 1-mana artifact. I think the first copy of this in black decks is probably worth taking as a C+, which makes it a pretty good common. Next up, it's Dune Mover, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature Phyrexian Golem at common. It's got Toxic 1. When it enters the battlefield, you can search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, shuffle your library, and put that card on top. This kind of fixing is usually pretty underwhelming. Putting a card on top of your library is just way worse than putting the card in your hand or on the battlefield. But it has solid stats, it brings Toxic to the table, and it does fix your mana, even if it doesn't do that super well. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's the Filigree Silex, which costs 2 generic for a rare legendary artifact. You can tap it and put an oil counter on it. You can tap it and sacrifice the Silex to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value equal to the number of oil counters on the Filigree Silex, or you can tap it and remove 10 oil counters from among permanents you control and sacrifice it, and it deals 10 damage to any target. So this is basically an upgraded Ratchet Bomb, which is cool and will mean it sees a lot of play in other formats, but I don't think it's great in Limited. It's just not going to be consistent. These sorts of sweeper effects that take a ton of time to set up and are narrow tend to be pretty mediocre. This kind of card is great in formats with really low curves where you can easily get it to blow things up, but most limited formats just aren't that. Now, there are tokens in this set, and this can blow them up immediately, and sometimes that will matter. The additional oil counter upside on the card is interesting, and does give the card something to do in situations where you can't really set this up to be a good sweeper. As we've already seen, there are lots of oil counters and proliferate in the set, but 10's a lot, so I think this is probably just a C. Next up, it's Furnace Skull Bomb, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can pay 1 and sack it to draw a card, or you can pay 1 generic and a red to put 2 oil counters in target artifact or creature you control and draw a card. Activate only as a sorcery. This is maybe the worst of the bunch, mostly because its effect is more niche than the others. If you don't have a permanent that cares about oil counters, it doesn't do anything, while the others have effects that pretty much always do something in most decks. It can still be cycled away easily, and when you can get value out of the counters, it's going to feel solid, but I think it's a bit worse than the other Skull Bombs. I'm giving it a C-. Next, it's Gra's Unstoppable Juggernaut, which costs 8 generic mana for a legendary artifact creature, Juggernaut at rare. It's a 7/5. Juggernauts you control attack each combat if able, Juggernauts you control can't be blocked by walls, and other creatures you control have base power and toughness, 5/3, and are Juggernauts in addition to their creature types. This is a cool callback to the old school Juggernaut, effectively making your whole board into old school Juggernauts, and that will usually enhance your board state. Your average creature is likely to be worse than a 5/3. Making the whole board hit that hard is pretty real, and at that stage of the game when you cast Graz, your opponent probably can't be hit by more than one of them. All of that said, Graz costs a ton of mana, and also comes with some downside. Making all of your stuff attack isn't always a good thing. So I think the mana cost, the need for a developed board, and the downside probably keeps this from being anything better than a C. Next up, it's Ichorplate Golem, which for 3 generic is an uncommon artifact creature Phyrexian Golem. It's a 2/3. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it has one or more oil counters on it, put an oil counter on it, and creatures you control with oil counters on them get +1/+1. So, an easy to cast 3 mana 2/3 is not a bad starting point, and the oil counter upside here feels very real in the format. It does probably mean that it's best in the blue-red deck in particular, but I think even if you just have like 2 or 3 creatures that do something with oil counters, you're playing this. I'm giving it a B, and I feel like it might have an even higher ceiling in the right deck, but most decks in this format will be able to get some pretty good value here. Next up, it's Maze Skull Bomb, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can sack it and pay 1 to draw a card. You can pay 2 generic and a green and sack it to give a creature +3/+3 and trample and draw a card, activate only as a sorcery. So, we're talking about a card that cycles at worst, and it can have a pretty real effect when you have the time to use its ability. I think it's another C. Next up, it's Mirran Safehouse, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. As long as it is on the battlefield, it has all activated abilities of all land cards in all graveyards. This has a cool design, especially because it even gains the ability to tap for mana, but this won't amount to much more than a hard-to-use 3 mana rock in this format, and that's just not worth the card in Limited. It's an F. Next up, it's Monument to Perfection, which costs 2 generic for a rare artifact. You can pay 3 and tap it to search your library for a basic sphere or locust land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. You can also pay 3 generic to have it become a 9/9 Phyrexian Construct artifact creature that loses all abilities and gains Indestructible and Toxic 9. Activate only if there are 9 or more lands with different names among the basic sphere and locust lands you control. This has a really cool design, but it's pretty much a dud in Limited. We've seen artifacts that let you search up a land for 3 mana before, and they're usually way too clunky and slow to be worth using. Moreover, actually getting enough lands in play to make it so this can animate into this really scary creature is near impossible. There is a cycle of common spheres in the set that can help you out a little bit, but it's still going to be a huge challenge, especially to get it going remotely early in the game. And by remotely early, I mean like turn 9. It's just not going to happen. I wish it would work out. It would be a pretty cool thing for it to work out, but it's just not going to. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it is Mirror Convert, which for 2 generic is a 2/1 artifact creature Phyrexian Mirror. At uncommon, it's got Toxic 1, and you can tap it and pay 2 life to add 1 mana of any color. This is pretty good. It ramps your mana, fixes your mana, and even has kind of a decent baseline as a 2 mana 2/1 with Infect 1. I think that whole package is worth an early pick. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it's Mirror Custodian, which is a 3 mana 2/3 artifact creature mirror at common. When it enters the battlefield, you scry 2, then each opponent may scry 1. If this only scried 2 for you, it would be a pretty nice common and a C+. Scry 2 is nice card selection. Obviously, though, letting your opponent also scry 1 makes this worse, but it still seems pretty solid. I'm giving it a C. Next up, it's Mirror Kinsmith, which costs 4 generic mana for a 3/1 artifact creature mirror at common. When it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a mirror card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. So, there aren't really that many mirrors in this set, so I mostly don't see this getting off the ground. If you have at least 3 of them, it's probably worth playing, as it will be able to generate a 2-for-1, and if you have a Mirror Convert, this can sort of be a source of fixing, because you can search up that creature that can add mana of any color. Still, it's probably an F in most Limited decks, and a C in a deck that gets enough mirrors. Next up, it is Phyrexian Atlas, which costs 3 generic for a common artifact. It can tap to add 1 mana of any color, and it has Corrupted. When you tap it, each opponent who has 3 or more poison counters loses 1 life. In most formats, a 3 mana rock just isn't worth it. You know, there are some where they work out, but I'm going to lean towards them not really working here, because that's usually the case. You should just be adding more meaningfully to the board on turn 3 than playing something like this. And using up a card that doesn't do anything but give you a mana boost can be rough. In theory, this does start doing something in the middle part of the game where it starts making your opponent lose 1 life every turn. I don't think I'm in on this. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Prophetic Prism, which for 2 generic is a common artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. You can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color. We've seen this before, and it's always pretty good. Filtering mana is, of course, inefficient, and this doesn't actually net you mana in any way. But the fact that this can fix your mana, it's an artifact, and it replaces itself all really matters. Actually getting a card worth of value back out of a card like this is a big deal. I'm giving it a C+. Next up, it's Prosthetic Injector, which for 1 generic is an uncommon artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +0/+2 and is toxic 1, and it has an equip cost of 1. This is cheap to play and equip, but it doesn't feel like it's going to be worth a whole card. +0/+2 is a meager boost, and while Toxic and Equipment have synergy in the format, there are just way better options to do both of those things, which are also at lower rarities. I'm giving this a D. Next up, it's Rib Skiff, which for 4 generic mana is an uncommon artifact vehicle. It's a 4/4, it has Toxic 2. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, and it has Crew 3. So, a 4 mana 4/4 with Crew 3 is pretty bad, but this does replace itself, and that's always nice, and Toxic has some real upside. Getting a 2-for-1 with this is pretty doable. The times where you can't crew it might be a little rough, but I think it's a C+. Next up, it's Soulless Jailer, which for 2 generic is a 0/4 artifact creature Phyrexian Golem at rare. Permanent cards and graveyards can't enter the battlefield. Players can't cast non-creature spells from graveyards or exile. These abilities don't hate on a whole lot in the format, but it is a 2 mana 0/4 that happens to be an artifact, so it probably isn't a complete disaster to play it. I don't think the typical deck in the format will have enough cards that the ability comes up consistently, but there are a few uncommons in the format that this actually does something against. It's probably a D. Next up, it's Staff of Completion, which for 3 generic is a mythic rare artifact. You can tap it and pay 1 life to destroy target permanent you own. You can tap it and pay 2 life to add 1 mana of any color. You can tap it and pay 3 life to proliferate. You can tap it and pay 4 life to draw a card, or you can pay 5 to untap Staff of Completion. This is a fun callback to Staff of Domination, but like that staff, this isn't anything special and limited. The pay 1 life ability almost never comes up. You know, if you have some sacrifice payoffs, it can do a thing. The 2 life ability makes this a really mediocre mana rock. Now, the other 2 abilities, paying 3 to proliferate or 4 to draw a card, is where things do get interesting, but that amount of life can add up quickly, and having a card that makes you pay life that also doesn't usually add to the board seems like a recipe for disaster in a lot of games. If you can combine this with some life gain, it maybe gets a little interesting. I mean, the idea of playing this and proliferating right away to impact the board right away is going to feel good on some boards, but man, it just seems too situational, and the life you pay is significant. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Surgical Skull Bomb, which for 1 generic is a common artifact. You can pay 1 and sack it to draw a card, or you can pay 2 generic and a blue and sack it to return a creature to its owner's hand and draw a card. Activate only as a sorcery. Like the others, this cycles at worst, and it can have a real impact on the board that still ends up replacing itself. I think it's a C. Next, it's Sword of Forge and Frontier, which for 3 generic is a mythic rare artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from red and from green, and whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, exile the top 2 cards of your library. You may play those cards this turn. You may play an additional land this turn, and it has an equip for 2. So, all the other cards in this mega cycle have pretty much always been bombs. Even just +2/+2 and protection from 2 colors is a huge problem for your opponent in many games. With everybody playing 2-color decks in Limited, there's a pretty good chance red or green is one of them. Obviously, though, it's the effect that you get when you hit your opponent that makes this really good, as it will just start drawing you extra cards at a crazy rate. You can get up to 2 extra cards when you hit your opponent, and it even makes sure you get some value if you hit 2 lands. So it grants an efficient boost, one that can be moved around all game long, and the card advantage it grants is unbeatable. I think it does enough to be a bomb, like most of its predecessors, giving it an A. Next up, it's Tablet of Completion, which for 2 generic is a rare artifact. You can tap it and put an oil counter on it. You can tap it and add Colorless. Activate only if the Tablet of Completion has 2 or more oil counters on it. And you can pay 1 and tap it to draw a card. Activate only if the Tablet of Completion has 5 or more oil counters on it. This looks pretty bad to me. It takes way too long to get going. Getting 2 oil counters on it won't exactly feel amazing anyway. You know, a 2 mana rock, which is a lot better than a 3 mana rock, but the fact that you have to do so much work to get it to the point where it can tap for mana anyway kind of defeats the purpose of it being a 2 mana rock. So you need to get to 5 before this really starts delivering value that's worthwhile, and that's a lot, even in a format with a bunch of proliferate. I think this is just an F. Our final artifact is Zenith Chronicler, which costs 2 generic for a 3/1 artifact creature Phyrexian construct at rare. Whenever a player casts their first multicolored spell each turn, each other player draws a card. A 2-mana 3/1 isn't a terrible baseline, and the Chronicler comes with an interesting effect. Obviously, it's going to be at its best in a deck with very few multicolored cards, since you can make the effect one-sided. As we've already seen, this is not a set with a huge multicolored theme, with only the Signpost uncommons and some rares and mythics actually being multicolored, so the effect will only be coming up like 0 to 2 times when you draft this. One nice thing is that even if you do have multicolored cards of your own, you can play with that knowledge. In other words, you can trade it off for something so you don't give your opponent a card. That's not something your opponent has the luxury of doing. So I think it has an okay baseline. You'll be able to net a card with it often enough that it's probably a C. Now we move into lands. First up, there's a common cycle of spheres. They're all like the Autonomous Furnace here. They're all common land spheres. They enter tap. They can tap for a color of mana, and you can pay 1 generic and a color of that mana and tap it and sacrifice it to draw a card. This is a solid utility land cycle. They enter tapped, so you don't want too many of them, but the fact you can cash them in the later stages of the game for a card is pretty nice and can help when you're flooding out. Collectively, I'm giving this cycle a C. We've also got a rare cycle of fast lands. They all enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or fewer other lands, and then can tap for 2 colors of mana, like Black Cleave Cliffs here. These all offer nice fixing, like most dual lands do, and the fact they enter untapped early is pretty nice, giving them a C. Next up, it's Mirrex, which is a rare land sphere. You can tap it for colorless. You can tap it and add 1 mana of any color. Activate only if Mirrex entered the battlefield this turn. You can pay 3 generic and tap it to make a 1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifact creature token with Toxic 1, and this creature can't block. The turn you play it, this is pretty good at fixing your mana. After that, it isn't good at fixing your mana at all. But it can still tap for colorless and crank out pests. The pest tokens are significantly worse than most 1/1 tokens. I think Toxic 1 is nice upside, but being unable to block is pretty big downside. One of the great things about like token factory cards is that if you're behind, you can crank out tokens to protect you. These tokens can't do that at all. But I think between the fact that it can fix your mana for a turn and crank out bodies that do get added to the board probably means it's fine, giving it a C. Next up, it's the Monumental Facade, which is a rare land sphere. It enters the battlefield with 2 oil counters. You can tap it for colorless. You can remove an oil counter from it and put an oil counter on target artifact or creature you control, activate only as a sorcery. So we've already seen oil counters are definitely a thing in this set, but I have a hard time imagining that you're going to end up with so many things that use oil counters that you're actually going to want to use this, especially in a set where Proliferate is everywhere and far more flexible at giving you more oil counters. Basically, this is bad for your mana base, and it has very little reason to actually be played, even in an oil counter heavy deck. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's the Mycosynth Gardens, which is a rare land sphere. You can tap it for colorless, you can pay 1 and tap it to add 1 mana of any color, and you can pay X and tap it, and it becomes a copy of target non-token artifact you control with mana value X. I'm not normally a huge fan of filter lands. They tend to be pretty clunky at fixing your mana, and that is true here, but the upside here is pretty legit. I think there are enough artifact creatures in this set that it will feel like a creature land a significant chunk of the time, and those always perform well, since it lets you turn a land into something that actually impacts the board. In some ways, it has more flexibility than a creature land because it can copy other things. The downside is, once it becomes a copy of something, it's going to lose all of these other abilities, so it will no longer be able to add mana for you, and you can't like move it around and have it copy other stuff. But I still feel like this is a pretty powerful utility land. It can fix your mana up until you get to a point where you want to make it into something. And I think I'm in for that. I'm giving it a B-. Next up, it is the Seed Core, which is a rare land sphere. You can tap it for colorless, and you can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, but you can spend that mana only to cast Phyrexian creature spells, and it has Corrupted. If your opponent has 3 or more poison counters, you can give a 1/1 creature +2/+1 until end of turn. So you probably noticed already that there are a lot of Phyrexians in this set, and actually, a lot is probably an understatement. I think this has to be the set that has the most lopsided number of creatures of a single type in it. The vast majority of creatures in this set are Phyrexian, including creature tokens, some of which are 1/1s, like the pests, or mites, I guess they are. So you'll be able to make mana of any color with this for a lot of the creatures in your deck, especially if you're not in red-white. If you're in red-white, you're more likely to have things that aren't Phyrexian. If you're in the other color pairs, you're pretty likely to have like 80% Phyrexians. So this can really fix your mana in those situations. And the ability to buff 1/1s matters, again, especially when we're talking about those tokens. So I think overall this is a C+. So, those are all the multicolored and colorless cards in Phyrexia, all will be one. Tomorrow I'll be back with my thoughts on all the white cards. If you enjoyed this video and it helped you out, consider liking it and sharing it so it can help others. If you want to make sure you catch the rest of this set review, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you're watching this when there are more videos in this set review out, you will see a playlist on your screen shortly. Lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and my work on the channel and get some perks, you can do that by becoming a patron, by buying Need to Hone merch, or by being a channel member. You can find ways to do all of those things in the description. Thanks for watching.